Hague. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I wish to make a statement on the Cabinet Secretary's report on the Indian operation at Sri Harmandir Sahib, also called the Golden Temple, in Amritsar in June 1984. The House will recall that on the 13th of January, concerns were raised regarding two documents released to the public in the National Archives. The documents relate to the painful events that followed the occupation of the temple site by Sikh dissidents in December 1983, which led to a 6-month standoff with the Indian authorities. In June 1984, a 3-day military operation by Indian forces known as Operation Blue Star took place. Official Indian government figures estimate that 575 people died. Other reports suggest as many as 3,000 people were killed, including pilgrims caught in the crossfire. This loss of life was an utter tragedy. Understandably, members of the Sikh community around the world still feel the pain and suffering caused by these events. Given this, we fully understand the concerns raised by the two documents. They indicated that in February 1984, in the early stages of the crisis, the then British government sent a military officer to give advice to the Indian government about their contingency planning. Many in this House and the whole country rightly wished to know what connection, if any, there had been between this giving of advice and the tragic events at Amritsar over 3 months later. Within hours of the documents coming to light, the Prime Minister instructed the Cabinet Secretary to carry out an urgent investigation in 4 critical areas: why advice was provided to the Indian authorities, what the nature of that advice was, what impact it had on Operation Blue Star, and whether Parliament was misled. The Cabinet Secretary was not asked to investigate Operation Blue Star itself, or the actions of the Indian government, or other events relating to the Sikh community in India. While the Cabinet Secretary has investigated these specific matters, I can make clear that during his investigation, no circumstantial evidence has been offered or has surfaced of UK involvement in any subsequent military operations in the Punjab. This investigation has been rigorous and thorough. The Cabinet Secretary and officials have met Sikh organisations to ensure their concerns informed the investigation. They have spoken to individuals associated with the two documents, although some officials are now deceased. They have examined Hansard records from 1984 to the present day, and they've carried out an extensive and thorough search of the files held by all relevant departments and agencies from December 1983 to June 1984. Their search through some 200 files and over 23,000 documents found a very limited number of documents relating to Operation Blue Star. The report notes that some military files covering various operations were destroyed in November 2009 as part of a routine process undertaken by the MOD at the 25-year review point. This included one file on the provision of military advice to the Indian authorities on their contingency plans for Sri Harmandir Sahib. However, copies of at least some of the documents in the destroyed files were also in other departmental files, and taken together, these files provide a consistent picture of what happened. The Cabinet Secretary's investigation is now complete. Copies of the report have been placed in the libraries of both houses, and it is now being published on the government website. The report includes the publication of the relevant sections of 5 extra documents that shed light on this period, but which would not normally have been published. We've taken this step because the whole investigation has been based on a commitment to the maximum possible transparency. We want to be as open as possible with the British public, insofar as that does not undermine the principle upheld by successive British governments of not revealing any information relating to intelligence or special forces. The main findings of the Cabinet Secretary's report are as follows. First, on why the UK provided advice to the Indian government, the Cabinet Secretary has established that in early February 1984, the then government received an urgent request to provide operational advice on Indian contingency plans for action to regain control of the temple complex. The British High Commission in India recommended that the government respond positively to the request for bilateral assistance from a country with which we had an important relationship. This advice was accepted by the then government. Second, the Cabinet Secretary then examined the nature of the advice that was provided to India following that decision. He has established that a single British military advisor travelled to India between the 8th and 17th of February 1984 to advise the Indian intelligence services and special group on contingency plans that they were drawing up for operations against armed dissidents in the temple complex, including ground reconnaissance of the site. The advisor's assessment made clear that a military operation should only be put into effect as a last resort when all attempts at negotiation had failed. It recommended including in any operation an element of surprise and the use of helicopter-borne forces in the interest of reducing casualties and bringing about a swift resolution. This giving of military advice was not repeated. The documents show that the decision to provide advice was based on an explicit recommendation to ministers that the government should not contemplate assistance beyond the visit of the military advisor, and this was reflected in his instructions. The Cabinet Secretary found no evidence in the files, or from discussion with officials involved, that any other form of UK military assistance, such as equipment or training, was given to the Indian authorities. The Cabinet Secretary's report therefore concludes that the nature of the UK's assistance was purely advisory, limited, and provided to the Indian government at an early stage in their planning. Third, the report examines what actual impact UK advice had on the Indian operation, which took place between the 5th and 7th of June 1984, over 3 months later. The report establishes that during that time, the planning by the Indian authorities had changed significantly. The number of dissident forces was considerably larger by that time, and the fortifications inside the site were more extensive. The documents also record information provided by the Indian intelligence coordinator that after the UK military advisor's visit in February, the Indian Army took over lead responsibility for the operation, and the main concept behind the operation changed. The Cabinet Secretary's report includes an analysis by current military staff of the extent to which the actual operation in June 1984 differed from the approach recommended in February by the UK military advisor. Operation Blue Star was a ground assault without the element of surprise and without a helicopter-borne element. The Cabinet Secretary's report therefore concludes that the UK military officer's advice had limited impact on Operation Blue Star. This is consistent with the public statement on the 15th of January this year by the Operation Commander, Lieutenant General Bra, who said that no one helped us in our planning or in the execution of the planning. It is also consistent with an exchange of letters between Mrs. Gandhi and Mrs. Thatcher on the 14th and 29th of June 1984 discussing the operation, which made no reference to any UK assistance. Those parts of the letter relevant to Operation Blue Star are published with the Cabinet Secretary's report today. The Cabinet Secretary has also examined two other concerns raised in this House and by the Sikh community, namely that Parliament may have been misled or that the decision to provide advice may have been linked to UK commercial interests. The report finds no evidence to substantiate either of these allegations. The investigation did not find any evidence in the files or from officials of the provision of UK military advice being linked to potential defence or helicopter sales or to any other policy or commercial issue. There is no evidence that the UK at any level attempted to use the fact that military advice had been given on request to advance any commercial objective. The only UK request of the Indian government made following the visit was for prior warning of any actual operation so that UK authorities could make appropriate security arrangements in London in the event the UK received no warning from the Indian authorities before the operation was launched. The Cabinet Secretary also concludes that there is no evidence of Parliament being misled. There is no record of a specific question to ministers about practical British support for Operation Blue Star, and he concludes that the one instance of a written question to ministers related to discussions with the Indian government on behalf of the Sikh community after the operation. In sum, the Cabinet Secretary's report finds that the nature of the UK's assistance was purely advisory, limited, and provided to the Indian government at an early stage, that it had limited impact on the tragic events that unfolded at the temple 3 months later, that there was no link between the provision of this advice and defence sales, and that there is no record of the government receiving advance notice of the operation. Nonetheless, we are keen to discuss concerns raised by the Sikh community. The Minister responsible for relations with India, my right honourable friend, the member for East Devon, will discuss these with Sikh organisations when he meets them later today. This reflects the strong, positive relationship the government and all British governments have with the British Sikh community, which plays such a positive role in so many areas of our national life. We're also determined to look at the wider issues raised by these events about the management and release of information held by government. Under the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010, the 30-year rule has been superseded by a 20-year rule, so that from 2022, all annual releases will be after 20 years. However, it's not clear at the moment that this change is being approached in a uniform fashion by all departments. The Prime Minister has therefore decided to commission a review to establish the position across government on the annual release of papers and the ability and readiness of departments to meet the requirements of moving from a 30 to 20-year rule, including the processes for withholding information. This review will be carried out by the Prime Minister's independent advisor on ministerial standards, Sir Alex Allen. Nothing can undo, Mr. Speaker, the loss of life and the suffering caused by the tragic events at Sri Harmandir Sahib. It is quite right that the concerns that were raised about UK involvement have been investigated. It is a strength of our democracy that we are always prepared to take an unflinching look at the past. But I hope this investigation and the open manner in which it has been conducted will provide reassurance to the Sikh community, to this House and to the public, and in that spirit I present it to the House.
Mr. Douglas Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Foreign Secretary for the statement and for advance sight of it this morning? Can I also take this opportunity to thank colleagues who have campaigned to help uncover the truth about the tragic events of 1984. In particular, on this side of the House, may I pay tribute to my colleagues, the Right Honourable Member for Wolverhampton South East, the Right Honourable Member for Worley, the Honourable Member for West Bromwich East, and the Honourable Member for Wolverhampton North East. They have done important work on behalf of many of their own constituents, and today I think it is only right that as a House we offer our collective thanks for their determined efforts. The 1984 raid on the Golden Temple complex, as the Foreign Secretary made clear, codenamed Operation Blue Star, resulted in hundreds of deaths, devastating damage to the temple itself, and rising levels of sectarian violence, which also ultimately saw the assassination of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi later that year. So I welcome what light the report sheds on the British government's alleged involvement with these events and the fact that some of the key documents relating to this event and the British government's alleged involvement have now been published. But, Mr. Speaker, serious questions continue to be asked about the involvement, conduct and contribution of the British authorities at the time, going up to the highest level in the events that surrounded the storming of the Golden Temple and that ultimately cost so many innocent lives. In light of that, I would like to ask the Foreign Secretary the following questions. Firstly, I regret that the government has so far refused to accept our call that all relevant documentation relating to this incident that can be should now be made public. I welcome the publication of 5 further documents as part of today's report, but given that the report itself cites officials interviewed over the course of this investigation, will the Foreign Secretary now commit to publishing a list of those officials, and can he confirm whether any surviving ministers serving at the time were indeed interviewed as part of this investigation? Will he also confirm whether these testimonies will be made public? Secondly, on the terms of this investigation led by the Cabinet Secretary, I welcome the fact that following representations by the Sikh community, the Cabinet Secretary published a letter detailing the scope of his inquiry. But can the Foreign Secretary explain to the House why there was more than a 3-week delay in publishing these terms of reference? Can he further explain whether the terms of the inquiry changed over the course of the inquiry itself taking place? The terms of reference, as published in a letter from the Cabinet Secretary on the 1st of February, did not include specific reference to the time period covered by the investigation. Yet the final report sets out a time frame of December 1983 to June 1984. So can the Foreign Secretary explain why this time frame was not made public at an earlier stage? Many have already expressed regret that the investigation seemed to be covering only the first part of 1984, given the significance of events in the weeks and months after June 1984 and their direct link to the storming of the Golden Temple. So will the government now task the Cabinet Secretary to set out whether he believes there could be grounds for a fuller inquiry covering that longer period? Turning to the substance of the findings of the report states that the UK military advisor present in India during 18 to 17 February 1984 advised the Indian government that, and I quote directly, this type of operation should only be put into effect as a last resort when all other courses of negotiation had failed. But can the Foreign Secretary set out, based on the documents he has seen, but for understandable reasons may not be able to publish, what type of operation was being referred to in this case? The report also sets out that, again I quote directly, a quick analysis by current UK military staff confirms that there were differences between the June operation and the advice from the UK military officer in February. Can the Foreign Secretary explain the nature of this quick analysis undertaken on such a central part of the investigation? And does the Foreign Secretary expect a fuller review of this aspect of the evidence to be conducted? The report touches on the allegations that the potential sale of Westland helicopters was linked to the provision of military advice. It claims no evidence was found to substantiate this allegation, but none of the annexed documentation so far released pertains to this issue. The report cites, and I quote directly, ongoing contacts between UK and Indian officials around the time of Operation Blue Star on potential defence-related sales. So will the Foreign Secretary now commit to publishing this correspondence? Indeed, the Foreign Secretary spoke just a few moments ago of the exchange of correspondence between Prime Minister Gandhi and Prime Minister Thatcher, and yet only Prime Minister Gandhi's letter appears to have been published today. Will he undertake now to publish the response of Prime Minister Thatcher? Mr. Speaker, everyone in this House is aware of the continuing pain felt by the Sikh community around the world at the events of 1984, not just at the storming of the Golden Temple in Amritsar and the deaths and destruction that followed, but also the anti-Sikh violence following the assassination of Prime Minister Gandhi and the emergency period which saw arbitrary arrests, accusations of torture, rape and disappearances that are still unresolved today. While of course there are differences within the Sikh community itself on the issue of a separate Sikh state, there is unanimity in their horror at these events. For British Sikhs, there has been, over recent weeks, the additional burden of worry that their own government may have been involved in these actions. So the government has a responsibility, indeed a duty, to address those very widespread concerns and fears. And if they are able to provide answers to all of those concerns and questions, then we as the opposition will support them in that endeavour.
The Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for his questions, and he's right to draw attention to the efforts of several of our colleagues on these and other issues, always to find out the truth about events in the past as well as in our own times. And my honourable friend, the member for Wolverhampton South West, is another example of that. And he's quite right as well to refer to the anxiety about these events of many people expressed over recent weeks, and that's why we should do everything we possibly can to set out the truth of the matters as that can be discovered from documents and from discussions with officials, which I think is, taken what I said earlier as a whole, a reassuring story to the House and to the public and to the Sikh community. He asked about some specific questions on process, whether we would publish a list of officials. No, I don't think that would be the appropriate thing to do. I think it is important to protect the anonymity of some of the officials and military personnel involved. He asked whether ministers had been spoken to, and yes, the Cabinet Secretary's investigation included discussions with the senior ministers of the time. He asked about whether the terms of the inquiry changed. No, they didn't change, except to the Cabinet Secretary's work covered over the last few was expanded to cover some additional concerns that had been raised during the last few weeks. And we may come to some of those in the questions later, Mr. Speaker, but the terms of the inquiry remained the same, and there isn't really any mystery about the dates that the Prime Minister at the beginning asked the Cabinet Secretary to investigate these specific events, the issue of whether there had been UK involvement in the specific events of the leading up to and during Operation Blue Star in June 1984. That's therefore the time frame from the start of what was happening at the location in question, December 1983, to the Indian operation in June 1984. But as the right honourable gentleman can gather from my statement, the Cabinet Secretary is able to go beyond that to say that in these 23,000 documents, he has seen no evidence, so there is no circumstantial evidence of British involvement in any subsequent military operation in the Punjab. And that has been one of the questions that has been raised. Could there have been? There were subsequent operations called Black Thunder 1 and 2 in later years. Could there have been British military involvement in those? And the answer from everything the Cabinet Secretary has seen, examining the hundreds of files, 200 files, is the answer to that is no. The relevant documents here are being published, those that can be published, while upholding, as I say, principles on publication that all British governments have always observed. Those documents that relate specifically to Operation Blue Star are being published here. There will, of course, be the publication over the coming years of many more documents concerning British relations with India in this time. So I certainly would not want to suggest no more documents will be published that shed light on relations between Britain and India over through the 1980s. It's the norm, as I understand how the 30-year rule is implemented, moving now to a 20-year rule. It's when it's 30 years from the file coming to an end, and that file contains documents from earlier years. So, of course, there will be subsequent documents to be published about this period, but the relevant files have all been searched, and the documents that shed light on Blue Star are these. He asked about the military quick analysis. I don't think the word quick should be used in some pejorative sense here. This has been quite a quick report. These concerns arose only a few weeks ago. Military experts have provided that analysis. But actually, even to a layman, it is clear that the military operation mounted was very, very different from any that is being discussed in these documents. It was entirely different, as I mentioned earlier, without the element of surprise, with no helicopter-borne forces. It was conducted by the Indian Army, not by paramilitary forces who were present in February when the UK military advisor was there. And so, even to the non-expert on these matters, the military operation is clearly very fundamentally different, the one that was mounted in June, from any that was being discussed in February 1984. And so, overall, I think this is the right degree of transparency, and a strong degree of transparency, and a thorough and good job by the Cabinet Secretary. And I think we should be prepared to support it as such.
Mr. Paul Uppal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for the swiftness with which he's brought his statement to the House. Most importantly, I think that it's right that we recognise that British involvement here was not in any shape or form malicious, and particularly the line that military option was only going to be used as a last resort. None of us can change what has happened yesterday, but we can change today and tomorrow. If documents cannot be released to the general public, can I make the unusual step for my right honourable friend to make sure that they are released in the widest possible audience, but within the proper environment? In addition to that, will my right honourable friend work with fellow parliamentarians, Sikh organisations and the Indian High Commission to start a process of truth and reconciliation, so that finally, after 30 years, victims and families can finally start to feel a sense of justice?
Yes, I fully accept my honourable friend's point. It's important that we do everything we can in establishing the truth about where controversies arise, such as this, to help that process of being able to move on from these terrible events and encouraging people to be able to live and work successfully together. And I certainly will look at the point that he makes about the release of documents. This is one of the issues which the review about the releasing of documents can cover, because questions can arise on this about when documents should be withheld and how the 30-year rule, becoming the 20-year rule, is being implemented. And I think these are fair questions, and so Sir Alex Allen's review will look at this, and I think we will all want to make sure that the same reassuring transparency that is evident in the Cabinet Secretary's report is continued in future years as further documents are released over future years.
Mr. Tom Watson.
I must take issue with the Foreign Secretary's conclusions. In 1984, the Commons was told that a march to commemorate the thousands of massacred Sikhs was cancelled on public order grounds. Yet newly revealed cabinet minutes show the real reason. They say, in view of the importance of the British political and commercial interests at stake, it would be necessary to explore every possibility of preventing the march from taking place. Export contracts worth £5 billion could be at stake. I have to say to the Foreign Secretary, in the year we commemorate the loss of 80,000 Sikhs in the 1914-18 war, isn't the least we can do to apologise to those Sikhs who were misled in 1984?
Well, I think the Honourable Gentleman should be clear about what the Cabinet Secretary is saying in this report, because I think he is making a different point about different events. And, well, he is, because by definition he is, but let me explain the point. What the Cabinet Secretary is saying in his report is that there is no evidence in these files of the provision of UK military advice in February 1984 being linked to defence sales or any other policy issue. Now, that is, well, I can only explain the facts as presented by the Cabinet Secretary, and that's the evidence from 23,000 documents. The Cabinet Secretary is not saying that in wider relations or other matters of policy between India and the UK, that such matters are not of importance. He's saying that on this issue, that is what the documents show, and we all have to work from what the documents show, what the facts.
Given the distress felt by the Sikh community and their desire for clarity about the events at Sri Harmandir Sahib, it is obviously very regrettable that a key file was destroyed in 2009. Can the Foreign Secretary tell us at what level oversight would have been exercised or permission given for the destruction of that file, and whether or not we now need to review procedures to make sure that such sensitive and important material are not destroyed in future?
Yes, this is an important point, and the review that I've just announced by Sir Alex Allen will be able to cover this point. These decisions are made at official level. They are going on all the time under all governments. They're not made on any political basis. They're not conducted by ministers. The implementation either of the 30-year rule or in this case of the MOD reviewing documents at some documents at a 25-year point is an official and continuous process. And judgments have to be made all the time about what is released, in this case what was destroyed. In retrospect, looking at that, we can all question that particular judgment. But then that means that the review that has been established must look at issues like that so that we can all be satisfied that important files will not be destroyed in the future.
And that's Sawa.
Much, Mr. Speaker, this is an issue that has caused great sadness to the Sikh community in Scotland, across the UK and indeed right across the world. And the very least that a community that enriches our economy, our culture and enriches our society deserves from this is closure. They'll never be able to overcome the sadness, they'll never get those lives back. But sadly, I don't think so. The report today gives them that closure that they need. And I would urge the Foreign Secretary to please have a further investigation that looks into the full communication that took part between this government, the UK government and the Indian government, both in the lead up to the storming of the temple and the events post it too.
Well, I do emphasise to the Honourable Gentleman the extent and thoroughness of what the Cabinet Secretary has done. 23,000 documents is not a small number, even by government standards. 200 files is not a small number. And so I have no reason, this is done by the Cabinet Secretary, not by me or any other minister. But having looked at it, having read the Cabinet Secretary's report, I have no reason to think that it's not a very thorough piece of work. And so I do think that it helps all of us, including the people in the Sikh community of whom he's quite right to speak in the terms that he does. I think it helps all of us actually to understand these events, and it should help all of us to see them in their true light. And so I hope that it will be of, as I said earlier, of some reassurance to them and to the House and to the wider public.
Sir Edward Garnier.
Thank you, sir. Given the strong and deep links between the Sikh community in my constituency and India, will you agree with me that the reaction of Sikhs in Britain, both within my constituency and elsewhere, was entirely understandable on the publication of the documents not so long ago? Will he therefore use his best efforts to ensure that in future, and he mentioned the possibility of further documents coming to light in due course which reflect back upon this period, will he do his best to ensure that future such surprises are either eliminated or at least mitigated to prevent the very understandable reaction and unnecessarily happening in future?
Well, I absolutely agree with my right honourable friend about that people were right to feel very concerned and anxious when they heard about this last month. I don't think on all issues we can avoid all surprises when government documents are published. We want them to be published. In fact, we want them to be published faster. This government has brought in the 20-year rule, and I'm sure on some other issues under whichever government of any party, there will be surprises in there somewhere, and we can't screen those out. But where there are issues raised that do cause great concern, and there is a legitimate demand for events to be investigated in the past, well, then we should do so in exactly the way that we have done on this occasion.
Seema Malhotra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary is right to have described the loss of life in 1984 as an utter tragedy, and my constituents, along with other members' constituents, have raised their real concerns and also shared their personal stories of families, their family that were affected. Understandably, this will not be the end of the matter, and my constituents will want time to study the report, to be able to raise questions and to see this through to what other members have described as closure on this terribly tragic matter. Will the Foreign Secretary commit for there to be ongoing dialogue and meetings with representatives from the Sikh community in order that this dialogue is sustained and people feel that their needs, their questions have been heard?
Yes, I think that's quite right, and she's right to say that people will want to read the report. It's only just been published to the public as I started to give my statement, and I hope that it is widely read and discussed. And she's quite right too to say that the process of dialogue and understanding should go on, and there will be some of that this afternoon. My right honourable friend will be holding meetings this afternoon, and we're all very happy to do so in the Foreign Office and other departments. My noble friend Baroness Varsi, the Minister of Faith and Communities, will also be involved in such meetings, and so that process of discussion, which may help bring such closure, will certainly go on.
Sir Edward Lee.
I wasn't actually standing, but I'm very. If you wish, can I just ask one very short question? Why were we consulted in the first place? Why us?
The honourable gentleman was certainly standing at one point. He was on my list. But anyway, he's the most dexterous of fellows and always capable of adjusting, as he's just proved. Foreign Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend has managed to ask an interesting question, even though he wasn't expecting to. Why were we consulted? It's not clear from the documents as to it is not obvious why, except that we can all make our guesses as to why. India, facing this situation, wanted expertise from the rest of the world. British expertise in that time as today in tackling difficult security situations is renowned. And so British advice was asked for. I think that is the simple explanation.
I don't want to dispute the Honourable Gentleman's word. Perhaps he was just having a therapeutic stretch, I don't know. Mr. Virendra Sharma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Being a Punjabi myself, born and brought up there, studied in the institutions run by the Sikh community back in Punjab. So I fully understand the feelings and the sentiments. Can the Secretary of State give a commitment today in relation to the question raised by my learned friend from a member of West Bromwich, that he will further investigate the points he has raised in his statement?
Well, this statement is about these specific events. He understands very well that Cabinet Secretary's report is about these specific events. There are many other aspects to relations between the UK and India. Many positive aspects, sometimes very controversial aspects. And wherever there is something that we feel should be investigated, then we must be prepared to look at it. But I haven't seen any, and certainly the Cabinet Secretary in producing this report hasn't turned up other circumstantial evidence that we think requires this sort of investigation. But of course, we don't know what evidence will ever be turned up in the future, so we can't rule out all investigations for the future.
Sir Richard Ottaway.
It's important to put issues like this into context. This incident was in 1984, just 3 years after the Iranian embassy siege, which was successfully dealt with by the UK security forces. And this may be the answer to my right honourable friend, the member for Gainsborough, that given the expertise in handling these situations that was developed at the time, would he agree that a request for help under these circumstances was completely understandable?
Well, I think my right honourable friend has answered the spontaneous question of my honourable friend, the member for Gainsborough, so I'm glad this discussion is going on in the rest of the House without the need for me to intervene in it. And I think that is right. The Iranian embassy siege had taken place a few years earlier. It was known then in the world that British forces were skilled at conducting operations with minimal loss of life. That is always the spirit in which they give advice, and I think from everything we can see in this instance, that was the spirit on that occasion, although it's not for us now to defend or promote the decisions made 30 years ago. So I think my right honourable friend is almost certainly correct.
Fiona McTaggart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary said that there is no evidence of Parliament being misled. And as he's aware, it was my predecessor as MP of Slough who was told by a Foreign Office Minister on the 30th of July 1984, as this is an internal matter, we have not sought to discuss it with the Indian government. The rest of the paragraph relating to that question is a description of the nature of that question. And actually, he has informed us that the Cabinet Secretary did not look at papers after the 5th of June. So it seems to me impossible from the Cabinet Secretary's inquiry to know whether at the 30th of July there had been discussions with the Indian government. Would the Foreign Secretary agree to examine the case about whether there were discussions after the 6th of June with the Indian government at a time when these killings were still continuing?
Well, I think there are several parts of the answer to that. One is that the Cabinet Secretary has said that there is no evidence in the documents, even after this point, of any British involvement in subsequent military operations in the Punjab. And so that's going beyond June 1984. It's also clear that from the letter from Mrs. Gandhi that there is no reference to, for instance, thanking the UK for any participation or support or advice. And so I I don't think from everything that we have seen here that there'll be much to add to what the Cabinet Secretary has said already. That would be my view, having read the report.
Sir Peter Tapsell.
May I also add to the spontaneous question of my right honourable friend from Lincolnshire? It's difficult for the present generation to realise how close our relationships still were with India at that time. My father and grandfather were both born in India, and I knew Indira very well, and I visited her a fortnight before she was assassinated at her home, and I said to her, it was after the Golden Temple disaster, and I said to her, was she wise to be surrounded with the Sikh bodyguard who looked magnificent in their uniforms? And she said they were absolutely loyal to her, and that some of them had served her father, and that if she was to get rid of them, this would be regarded throughout India as an insult to the other Sikhs. And there's absolutely, therefore, nothing sinister at all in Britain being asked, and many Brits at various levels, being asked for advice during that terrible period.
Well, this shows there is a remarkable prescience in my right honourable friend's questions to Mrs. Gandhi at that time. And of course, as always in general, we're not in the least bit surprised to find in the House that he knew her. And I indeed, several generations of the Gandhi family. And he is quite right to put it in that historical context, that a request for British advice, however then responded to, should be seen in that light.
Mr. John MacDonald.
The Foreign Secretary has hoped for reassurance. Can I say to him, I don't believe members of the Sikh community in my area will be reassured by the fact that a UK government was willing to provide any military support to desecrate the most holy place that they believe on this earth, without any semblance of an apology today. I also don't believe they'll be reassured by files going missing. I don't believe that they'll be reassured that this was an internal inquiry. Could I urge him now to move swiftly for a full, public and independent inquiry?
Well, no, Mr. Speaker, and I think that I think these facts are clearly set out by the Cabinet Secretary, a respected official, the most senior civil servant in the country, who has served governments of all parties, and does so in a non-partisan way. And I think everyone should be very careful. These are very sensitive matters, and everyone should be very careful about how they phrase these things, because to say that the UK gave military support to desecrate the temple is obviously a wild distortion of events, and I think he should regret that.
Mr. Rob Wilson.
Unlike the member for Hayes and Harlington, can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement and welcome the reassurance that it gives to the UK Sikh community about these events. But many Sikhs in my constituency do have questions, not only about Operation Blue Star, but wider questions about what happened in India in 1984. Most of the answers will lie in India, but will he commit to a full disclosure of any information it holds, the government holds, about the custody, interrogation, torture, disappearance and murder of thousands of Sikhs during that period?
Yes, my honourable friend is drawing attention to wider events, which others have also referred to, which cause enormous distress to the Sikh community, and in which many, many people suffered. And it's entirely understandable that people raise those events as well. Those are predominantly events within India, and we're not able to inquire into the actions of the Indian government. This investigation is about any question of UK involvement in one particular set of events. But I mentioned earlier that there will be, as over the next few years, there will of course be more government documents released The ones relating to these specific events have been examined by the Cabinet Secretary, but there will be other documents released about relations between the UK and India, and we will make sure, of course, that these are promptly and transparently released.
Ms. Kendall.
The Sikh community in Leicester has raised their deep concerns with me and my honourable friend, the member for Leicester South, who unfortunately can't be here, both about the attack on the Golden Temple and the wider events of 1984. Can I ask the Foreign Secretary, is he absolutely confident that all of the documents have been properly investigated and that the government is publishing as many of them as possible? Because in this day and age, with trust in politicians and institutions being so low, I believe people want to judge for themselves.
Yes, this is a very good point, a very fair question, and this is an investigation by the Cabinet Secretary. It's not by ministers, it's presented by the Cabinet Secretary to the Prime Minister. I think, as I say, that we should have confidence in that. It has involved going through a huge number of documents, and it does involve the publication of additional documents that would not normally be released. And so I think all of those should be helpful in giving the necessary assurance to people. And on top of that, as I've announced in my statement, there will be a review of how we release documents, making sure that all departments are living up to their responsibilities, doing so in a uniform way, including looking at the processes for withholding information. So I hope all of that, and the fact we're moving to a 20-year, not a 30-year rule, will fortify or produce some public confidence in the transparency of these processes.
Mark Pritchard.
The events of 1984 were tragic, and they still impact on the lives of many Sikh families in my constituency. But does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that it would be a disservice to the victims and their families if some members of Her Majesty's loyal opposition made this a party political issue rather than a pursuit of truth and transparency and closure for those families?
Well, of course, I agree with that, but I'm not accusing anybody in this House of doing anything other than seeking the truth about these matters. It's important we do that across parties. The procedures for the release of documents are established across parties, across different governments over a long period of time. I hope if we improve them and change them, that will also command cross-party consensus. So let us hope that across the House, all of us will always approach it in that spirit.
Mr. Pat McFadden.
The core fact exposed in the release of documents a few weeks ago and in the Foreign Secretary's statement today is that advice was given by this country in the run-up to an attack on the holiest place in Sikhism. Given that fact, and given the tremendous pain and grief over the broader events of 1984 in India, does the Foreign Secretary understand that there will be calls in the community for an apology or a gesture of reconciliation from the government, and could he give us his response to those calls? And can I also ask him, what can the government do internationally to get to the full truth of this matter, because the British Sikh community feels that that full truth has never been told?
Well, several parts to his question. I think this report should be acknowledged, even by those who criticise it, as being a big step in establishing the truth about many matters. It is clear, it does cover many documents, it is a thorough piece of work by the Cabinet Secretary. It's very important for us to support all processes of reconciliation, and to do that through the dialogue with the Sikh community that the government will continue, that I'm sure, and I hope all political parties in this country will always continue. And I think when it comes to judging for ourselves these past events, I think if any of us thought, if I thought that this country had at any time contributed to had materially contributed to unnecessary loss of life, well, then that would be something to say was a mistake or something for the country to apologise for. But that, of course, is not the case in these documents. That case case can't be made on these documents, and we have to respect, I think, what the documents say.
Heather Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate my right honourable friend for making this statement today? It's a very wounding time for many of the constituents in South Derbyshire that have contacted me, and I appreciate the candour that he's explained at the dispatch box today. What I would like to do, and I'm sure many honourable members will as well, is gather up these now public documents and get them back to our constituents so they can see for themselves. But I would like to congratulate the whole team for putting this particular package together. I think that will help calm matters down.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and as I said earlier, I hope that people will read the report and the documents and see for themselves that the government is being as transparent as possible about this, and therefore there is information for people to read and digest.
Reverend William McRae.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement to the House today. Accepting that there is nothing that we can say or do that can undo the tragic loss of life and the hurt felt within the Sikh community, and we in Northern Ireland know about that over 30 years. However, is the Foreign Secretary certain that the Cabinet Secretary's report and the examination of all the issues surrounding the Indian operation has been thorough, has been rigorous, has been factually correct, and that there has not been, nor will there be, any cover-up of the facts?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable General is quite right to say that nothing any of us can do or say makes up for what so many people experienced during these events. We all have to understand that. But it's important that we set out what happened, as we understand it, as clearly and transparently as possible, and I can give a very clear yes to the whole of his question.
Mr. Adam Holloway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a former Army officer representing a constituency with a very large number of seats, can I thank the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister for the very serious and rigorous way they've approached this. But can the Foreign Secretary confirm that had the distinguished SAS Major's advice been taken, there would have been a very, very much lower level of violence? Indeed, if his advice had been taken in full, there would have been no violence at all, rather than the, to my mind, appalling behaviour of the Indian government in the assault in Operation Metal and in the weeks and months that followed. And we must remember, of course, that for the victims of that, justice remains in very short supply.
Well, we could never know for sure, of course, what would have happened under different circumstances or a different plan. It's clear from the Cabinet Secretary's report that the UK military advisor gave advice about using negotiations and only using force as a last resort, and that the military advice he gave was partly based on the desire to reduce casualties all round. And so I think it is important that those points are fully brought out and understood, as my honourable friend suggests.
Fabian Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for British Sikhs, may I commend my honourable friend for West Bromwich East for bringing this matter to light in the first place. May I also thank the Foreign Secretary, the Prime Minister, and of course the Cabinet Secretary for their swift and transparent report. Would, however, the Foreign Secretary agree that even one military advisor going over in February 1984 will cause anger and hurt to the British Sikh community? And will he look at the possibility of a further report into the subsequent consequences of the attack on the Sri Harminder Sahib?
Well, first of all, I do understand how any of these matters, any of the things that we're discussing, can cause worry and speculation and suspicion, and that is the case, to be as transparent as possible about these things. He talks about a further report. I think it's important to remember that we can really only investigate and inquire into what we or our predecessors were responsible for. And the Cabinet Secretary's report does make clear that there's no evidence in the documents of any subsequent British military involvement in any military operations in the Punjab. There are many other wider issues and wider controversies which understandably cause people great distress to this day. but they are predominantly matters which are under the sovereignty of India, which are part of the Indian people's responsibility for their own affairs. And so there is a limit to how much the United Kingdom can inquire into those things.
Mr. Richard Fuller.
Mr. Speaker, in his question, my honourable friend, the member for Reading East, rightly placed these issues in the context for many British Sikhs of a search for justice and truth about the atrocities in 1984. In the consultations that his colleagues will take with Sikh organisations and others, can my honourable friend assure me that he will listen to these wider issues, and also assure me that he'll go beyond the national organisations to listen to local organisations as well?
Yes, absolutely. It must be part of our discussions to be open to discussing these wider issues. And I think every opportunity should be taken to discuss matters with local groups as well. And as ministers travel around the country, they will be pleased to do so.
Mr. Geoffrey Robinson.
Mr. Speaker, the Foreign Secretary will be aware that Coventry has a large, relatively large and very successful Sikh community, and he'll know probably that for the last 30 years since it first happened, I've been lobbied in this House repeatedly by them. We hope today that his statement will bring closure. I fear it won't, and I think one of the problems about it is the military files that have been destroyed, and recently much of what I've received from the Sikh community has been about that point, and I read in his statement today that one file was dealing actually with the provision of military advice to the Indian authorities on their contingency plans. Could you at least reassure the House that only some of those other destroyed military documents have been found in other files? Only some. Can you reassure the House that the bulk of those destroyed files did not relate to the critical period during February, June, and then immediately after June?
Well, as set out in my statement, there was this destruction of one file by the MOD in 2009, but it does turn out that many of the documents, some of the documents that would have been in it, are in other files around the rest of government. The reassuring thing, I think, is that all of the documents show a consistent picture. There isn't in the Cabinet Secretary's analysis of these documents something that remains unexplained. It is a consistent picture of the one visit in February 1984 by one military advisor, of no decision by the British government to give any further assistance beyond that, either in nature or in time, and of the actual operation in June 1984 being very different from the advice given by that one UK military advisor. And all the documents are consistent with that. In every department, across the whole of government, in all 200 files. And so when you think about it that way, it is a consistent picture and it should be of reassurance.
Mr. Stephen Phillips.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and can I commend my right honourable friend on a very frank statement. But I'm afraid I must press him on one point. During the course of the statement, he said the advisor's assessment made clear that a military operation should only be put into effect as a last resort when all attempts at negotiation had failed. It is therefore clear that there was an assessment during February 1984 of a potential military operation. Now, one of the things that causes such hurt to the Sikh community across the world is the use of artillery in particular, both at one of the holiest sites in Sikhism and indeed in the wider region. Can my right honourable friend assure the House that no British advisor, either this one or anyone else, ever gave advice that artillery should be used? And indeed, insofar as any advice was given, it was that a military solution was not the right way forward.
Well, I think I can be reassuring on that point, that the advice was that military solutions, and I think British military advisors would give this advice anywhere throughout the world, that military solutions are only for when all negotiations have failed. But also it specifically referred to the importance of speed and surprise and the use of helicopter-borne troops in order to achieve that and minimize casualties. That would not be consistent with the use of artillery, with all the consequent collateral damage and destruction caused by the use of heavy weapons.
Gapes. Mr. Speaker, those of us who've had the honour to visit the Golden Temple know that it is a place of peace and tranquility. And and its symbolism is very, very significant. When the Prime Minister went to India, he actually went to Amritsar, and he, as part of his visit, he also went to Jallianwala Bagh and signed the condolences or message at an atrocity carried out by the British military in 1919. Would it not be appropriate for us to say something about apologising for the fact there was even a minor, limited complicity in giving military advice to the Indian authorities, because otherwise it will be misinterpreted. The Prime Minister did the right thing when he went to India. Can we just do something now for the Sikh community?
I think, well, as he says, the Prime Minister did the right thing in making the statement that he did about other tragic events near Amritsar decades before, and expressing this country's regret for that. Absolutely the right thing, and I think across the whole House we support that. But he did that because of Britain's responsibility for those events, and apologies go with responsibility. I think can imply responsibility. If, as I said earlier, I think if any of us thought that any British assistance had contributed to unnecessary loss of life and to suffering in this or any other case, then we would all want to say that was a mistake and for the country to make an apology. But that's not what is established by the Cabinet Secretary's report. The picture is very different from that, and we all have to base our opinions in the end on the facts.
Mr. Chris White. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituency is also home to a large Sikh community. I'd like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to the huge contribution they make to local and national life. I'm pleased the government has investigated these issues so promptly. However, may I ask the Foreign Secretary what further steps he will take to reassure our Sikh community that this investigation has indeed been fully transparent and comprehensive?
Well, I think it's important to explain the investigation. That's what I'm doing today. I'm sure he will encourage his constituents to read the report. It's a report. It's not a report just for Parliament to read. It's a report for the public to read. It's published on the government's website. It's easy for members of Parliament to make the copies available, and so people will be able to judge for themselves about its transparency, about how much reassurance to take from it, and I hope be reassured that in this country we do, when we look at such documents, we do look into them. We respond to demands for investigations. We ask the highest-ranking civil servant in the country to lead those investigations. We ensure that officials from 30 years before are interviewed, that tens of thousands of documents are examined. There aren't actually many countries in the world that have that level of transparency about events in the past, or let alone in the present. And we should say those are good attributes of our country, and they're good examples of how we do face up to issues in the past.
Corbyn. Could I take the Foreign Secretary back to the answer he gave to my friend, the member for Coventry, a few moments ago? On page 2 of his report, he rather glibly says, under a 25-year procedure, a lot of Ministry of Defence files were destroyed. This issue isn't new. There have been concerns expressed ever since 1984. So what was going through the minds of people in the Ministry of Defence that they would destroy those files? Only some of them have been discovered by parallel files being kept in other departments. And why, at no stage in 1984, did any minister feel fit to tell the House of Commons that there had been a British military advisor sent to India? I was a member of the House at that time. No such reference was ever made. Therefore, there was not likely to be any question raised either.
It's hard. 1984 was even before I was a member of this House, and a few years before, and so it's hard to judge then the question why questions were not asked or why statements were not given. I don't think we can go back and judge that now. He said that I've said glibly in the report that this file was destroyed. It's the Cabinet Secretary's report. It's not my report, and he is reporting the fact. which is of the MOD destroying that file in 2009. It's not for me to explain that. That was under the previous administration and carried out by an official. It is not a political or ministerial decision. It raises a sufficient question that we have to look in the review that I've also announced today at such rules and how these things are carried out. And that will be part of what Sir Alex Allen is going to examine.
Mr. Mark Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to the question from the member for Wolverhampton South, will the Foreign Secretary, looking forward, do all he can to continue to build links with the Punjab, both politically and economic, but also encourage his colleagues across government to recognise the enormous contribution that the British Sikh population make both economically and socially?
Yes, I think our discussion today is a reminder of the importance of that and the understanding of that. I believe across all parties in this House that Sikhs in Britain make an enormous contribution to this country, and that is widely noticed and understood and recognised in our national life, and it's something that we want to continue, that we want to see flourish in the future, and none of these controversies or issues detract in our minds in this House from the importance of that contribution, and nor should they ever.
Emma Reynolds.
Mr. Speaker, there is real concern, distress and grief in the Sikh community in my constituency in Wolverhampton about the horrific events in June 1984. The correspondence released last month indicated that the then Foreign Secretary, Lord Howe, agreed to advise the Indian government, and the Foreign Secretary has confirmed that today. And whilst my Sikh constituents are shocked that that advice was given, they are also seeking further clarity about what was the contact between the then British government and the Indian government at that time. And with that in mind, will the Foreign Secretary therefore commit to disclose the full transcript of the Cabinet Secretary's interview with Lord Howe?
Well, the Cabinet Secretary has decided what to disclose in his report, which includes additional documents that would not normally be disclosed, and that do give additional details about this, and that confirm the picture set out in his report and in my statement. He and his officials have had discussions in the course of doing this report with officials and with senior ministers, but it's for him to set out to the Prime Minister, as he has done in his report, what he recommends to be published, and I think that provides a full picture and a transparent picture, and he's made the right judgment in what he said.
Mr. Robert Buckland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome my right honourable friend's statement. Sikhs in the community that I have the honour of representing still feel that the scars and the wounds that were left by the events of 1984 run deep and are still open, and the need for transparency is quite patently clear. Will my right honourable friend assure me, with regard to the nature of the advice given, was this a unique set of circumstances with regard to India, or are there other examples from other countries seeking military advice of the type sought in this case?
Well, it seems to have been unique in this context, in the context of operations in the Punjab. This is the only such occurrence of this that the Cabinet Secretary has discovered. But seen in a global context, of course, there will be many other occasions in the 1980s when governments of other countries asked the United Kingdom for military advice. There are occasions today when that happens, which we deal with as ministers today. So it's in no way unusual for a foreign country with friendly relations with the United Kingdom to ask for military advice.
Mr. Mark Durkan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Haywood report tells us that the recommendation and decision to agree the request were based on advice from the British High Commission that it would be good for the bilateral relationship, whereas refusal would not be understood by the Indian Prime Minister. The report doesn't tell us, and perhaps the Secretary of State could help if he can tell us, whether or not the recommendation from the High Commission involved any consideration whatsoever of the special sensitivity and sacredness of the Golden Temple site, or whether or not any of the British government's deliberations on that recommendation and decision to accept that advice involved any such consideration for the special status of that site.
Well, there are further documents published. The Honourable Gentleman will be able to study them attached to the report, and that is what we have on the motivations and decisions of ministers and diplomats at the time. So everyone can read for themselves what they go into. It's evident from the report of the UK military advisor's report that his advice was that military action should only be taken in this, or as I say, presumably in any other context, should negotiations fail. So I think that, of course, there would have been, I imagine there would have been a consciousness of the great significance of this site and the delicacy of the situation. But we can only go for sure on the documents that are there and on what they say, and he can read them like the rest of us.
Michael Ellis. I commend the Foreign Secretary and the Cabinet Secretary for a job well done and a neutral job. And rather like the father of the house, my own father was born in India, and in Northampton, Northern constituency I have the honour to represent, there are a large number of Sikh community members, and I visited the Gurdwaras and spoken to them and answered some of the questions where I could. Would the my right honourable friend confirm that, in fact, UK bilateral relations, not only with India, but with many countries around the world, mean both now and previously that we are regularly asked for assistance and bilateral advice by other countries, especially when they're dealing with difficult situations, and that we afford that assistance where we can?
Yes, my honourable friend is absolutely right. As I was just saying to our honourable friend, the member for Swindon, we are asked by the country, we have been over decades, for military assistance and advice. Those are not always things that we can discuss across the floor of the House in terms of the specific instances. When we do receive such requests for advice and we decide to give assistance, we apply, in the 21st century, we apply very high standards of human rights considerations, and of course always trying to minimize any loss of life. But it's not an uncommon thing for us to receive such requests.
Mr. Chris Williamson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When these documents came to light, there was a palpable sense of betrayal, anger, and incredulity within the Sikh community in my constituency. And it's clear from the questions today that many questions remain unanswered, and the Foreign Secretary has conceded that some documents were destroyed. Now, I know he said in response to my honourable friend, the member for Hayes and Hollington, that he would rule out an independent inquiry, but would he not at least accept that an independent, judge-led inquiry would allay any suspicions about a cover-up, allow former ministers to give full evidence, and actually enable it to be determined whether a full apology would be appropriate?
It's not. I do encourage the honourable gentleman to read the report, because I don't think it's possible to read this report and conclude that a cover-up has taken place somewhere. It's the very opposite of that. It is the most senior civil servant in the country looking at things in a dispassionate and of course non-partisan way, and being as open as possible with documents and showing that there's a very consistent picture from all the evidence and all the documents. Now, in those circumstances, I don't think it's possible to justify additional inquiries piled on top of inquiries. People may be interested in other issues and related issues that were beyond the scope of this investigation. And of course, it's wholly legitimate for them to pursue those issues. But on this specific question about what was the nature of British involvement in the events leading up to June 1984, I think we have a very clear answer from the Cabinet Secretary's report.
Peter Bone. Speaker, I think most members of the House will thank the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary for the speed of this inquiry and for making such a full statement. But one of the things that surprised me today, and I did not know this before, that routinely after 25 years, government files are destroyed 5 years before the 30-year rule. What the Foreign Secretary
surprises me at that. And in future, if we're going to a 20-year rule, will it mean that the 25-year rule is still in place, so all files will be available for publication?
Well, the interaction between the move from a 30-year rule to a 20-year rule and how departments treat their files after 25 years is, of course, an interesting question, because it makes the 25-year review rather moot. And again, this is why there is value in the further review that I have announced today, to make sure that all departments are doing that on a consistent basis, and that any lessons that need to be learned about when documents have been withheld or when they have been published can be learned collectively in the whole government. So I encourage him to await the outcome of that review to have the definitive answer to his question.
Mr. Barry Gardner.
The Foreign Secretary has been at pains to stress that the advice that was given by the British military advisor was not in fact followed, and it would therefore be inappropriate to take responsibility for the Blue Star operation and to issue an apology for that. Nonetheless, it was countenance to give advice. Indeed, advice was given about how to storm the holiest site in Sikhism. Is that not something which the Foreign Secretary should apologise for?
Well, I go back to my earlier answers, I think. I think it's fair to put it this way, that if any of us thought, in any part of the House, that Britain had contributed to serious or unnecessary loss of life elsewhere in the world, then that's right to acknowledge a mistake and to say the country apologises for that. But when the country clearly doesn't have responsibility for that, then I think that's in a different context. And we have to go on the facts, and I think the facts are clear about that. And of course he's really asking us to judge to a finer degree the decisions of ministers at the time, which I feel 30 years later in a different government is very hard to do. And can be unfair to do. So I stick to what I said earlier on this.
Mr. Philip Holloway.
Could I thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement, which I'm confident will be very reassuring to the long-established and highly respected Sikh community in Kettering. And of course, none of us should ever forget that 83,000 Sikhs gave their lives in both world wars for His Majesty's Armed Forces. Yeah. Would the Foreign Secretary agree with me that it's important not to put 2 and 2 together and make 5? Can he confirm the rank of the military advisor? And would he agree with me that the Iranian hostage siege and the raid on the Golden Temple in Amritsar are completely different exercises? The Iranian hostage siege was a precise surgical military engagement involving a very small number of armed soldiers and a very small number of hostages, and remarkably successful. The raid on the Golden Temple involved artillery, main battle tanks, helicopter gunships, and the execution of prisoners. And it is completely inconceivable that Her Majesty's government would send any military advisor to another government to recommend an assault of that kind.
Yes, I think there's a great deal in what my honourable friend says. It's been the culture of the British Armed Forces for a long time to avoid, wherever possible, civilian loss of life, to minimise casualties in any of the operations or anything similar to them to which he's been referring. And so there's a very big distinction between these operations. He's absolutely right about that. I'm not going to give any information which identifies the officer concerned, and he's quite right to refer to the huge contribution of Sikhs, of Indians, Sikh and non-Sikh, in the world wars. We owe a great deal to them, and we must remember that on many occasions over the coming years through the centenaries of the main events of the First World War.
Mr. Jim Cunningham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think given the contribution the Sikh community has made not only in Coventry but nationally and internationally, and more importantly economically to this country and in 2 world wars, at the very least we owe them an inquiry. And I think with the present investigation is a step in the right direction. I think we should have an inquiry, but more importantly, can I ask the Foreign Secretary what the Cabinet knew? Did the Cabinet take the decision to send the advisor? Who consulted the Cabinet?
On that, it's clear from the documents that are published that this was a decision of the Foreign and Defence Secretaries at the time in consultation with the Prime Minister. It was how the decision was taken. And on the subject of inquiries, these are the documents and these are the facts set out in the Cabinet Secretary's report. There's nothing in that report to suggest, and nothing in these documents to suggest, that some different form of inquiry would find any different information or come to any different conclusion.
Mr. Adrian Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many Sikhs in my constituency are concerned not just about the detail and nature of the advice given, but the principle that the British government was prepared to advise another government on an attack on a holy shrine. If we're to get reconciliation, would the Minister not be prepared to concede that at least it was an error of judgment by the then government and an apology is justified? But secondly, there are procedures in place to prevent any such repetition in future.
Well, thankfully there are no parallel situations we're dealing with in the world today. We do receive advice now in the 21st century for military advice, or we receive requests for military advice or cooperation. As I mentioned earlier, in responding to those, we're extremely conscious of all considerations of human rights, of avoiding loss of life. These are paramount factors in how the British government today, the British government as we practice our policies today, evaluates requests for assistance from other countries through their militaries or any other agencies. Now these policies have taken shape over the years, and we can't, it's very hard to speculate about exactly what considerations were in the minds of ministers 30 years ago. So on 30 years ago, all we can do is be as open as possible, as transparent as possible, let people evaluate the facts for themselves. But it wouldn't be unusual or unknown, as I've said earlier, for foreign governments to ask for military advice. And what is clear from this is that the military advice that was given was advice designed to minimize casualties and to stress that military action should only take place if negotiations had all failed.
Order. I thank the Foreign Secretary and colleagues. 10-minute rule motion. Mark Spencer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.